The Federal Reserve finds itself trapped in an unprecedented dilemma. At the heart of this crisis lies a staggering $9.1 trillion problem that fundamentally limits the central bank's ability to pivot its monetary policy. This isn't just about interest rates or inflation targets. It's about the structural transformation of the entire financial system over the past 15 years, and the consequences of emergency measures that were never meant to become permanent fixtures of the American economy. To understand why the Fed cannot simply change course, we need to examine the mechanics of what happened to its balance sheet and why unwinding this position has become virtually impossible without triggering systemic instability. Before the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet stood at roughly $900 billion. This represented normal central banking operations, holding treasury securities, providing liquidity to banks, and managing the money supply through traditional tools. Then came the Great Recession, and everything changed. The Fed launched quantitative easing programs that expanded its holdings to unprecedented levels. It purchased massive quantities of treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities, directly injecting liquidity into frozen markets. By the time the crisis subsided, the balance sheet had ballooned to $4.5 trillion. But here's where the story takes a critical turn. Instead of quickly reversing these emergency measures, the Fed maintained elevated holdings for years, and when the pandemic struck in 2020, it doubled down with even more aggressive purchases. At its peak in 2022, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet reached approximately $9 trillion. This represented nearly 10 times its pre-crisis size. The composition matters enormously. Roughly $5.5 trillion consists of treasury securities, the debt obligations of the US government. Another $2.7 trillion comprises mortgage-backed securities, essentially residential housing debt packaged and sold to investors. The Fed had transformed itself from a traditional central bank into the largest single holder of government and housing debt in the world. This wasn't abstract monetary theory. It meant the Federal Reserve owned nearly 1/3 of all treasury securities available in the market, and held a dominant position in mortgage markets that directly influenced housing prices and affordability across the country. Now consider what happens when the Fed attempts to reduce this position. The technical term is quantitative tightening, and it involves either selling these securities back into the market or simply letting them mature without reinvestment. Both approaches extract liquidity from the financial system. When the Fed sells treasuries, it removes money from circulation as buyers pay for those securities. This mechanically tightens financial conditions beyond just raising interest rates. The problem is scale. Unwinding $9 trillion isn't like adjusting a policy rate by a quarter point. It represents a fundamental shift in the supply and demand dynamics of the entire bond market. If the Fed attempts to sell too quickly, it floods the market with securities, driving prices down and yields up dramatically. This doesn't just affect government borrowing costs, it ripples through every corner of the financial system. The Treasury market is the bedrock of global finance. It determines the risk-free rate that anchors pricing for virtually every other asset. Corporate bonds, municipal debt, mortgage rates, auto loans, credit cards all reference Treasury yields as their baseline. When the Fed dumps trillions of dollars of treasuries into the market, it fundamentally disrupts this pricing mechanism. Yields spike not because of economic fundamentals or inflation expectations, but because of forced selling by the largest market participant. This creates volatility and uncertainty that spreads instantly across global markets. Foreign central banks hold treasuries as reserves. Pension funds rely on stable bond values. Banks use treasuries as collateral for countless transactions. A disorderly unwinding of the Fed's position threatens the entire edifice of modern financial markets. The mortgage-backed securities position creates an even thornier problem. When the Fed purchased these securities during and after the financial crisis, it effectively subsidized housing markets. By absorbing supply and keeping mortgage rates artificially low, it supported home prices and construction activity. This wasn't an unintended side effect. It was explicit policy designed to stabilize the housing sector. But now housing affordability has become a critical economic and political issue. If the Fed sells its mortgage holdings aggressively, mortgage rates rise sharply beyond what would be justified by the broader interest rate environment alone. This directly impacts housing markets, construction employment, and the wealth effect for homeowners. The central bank finds itself uncomfortably positioned as a key player in housing policy, unable to exit without potentially triggering a housing correction. There's another dimension that often gets overlooked. The Federal Reserve pays interest on the reserves that banks hold with it. When rates were near zero, this cost was minimal, but as the Fed raised rates to combat inflation, it suddenly found itself paying substantial interest to banks on their reserve holdings. By mid-2023, the Fed was paying over $250 billion annually in interest to banks. This creates a perverse situation. The central bank is simultaneously trying to tighten financial conditions while transferring enormous sums to the banking system. Those payments represent real resources, money that would otherwise flow to the Treasury as remittances from Fed profits. Instead, the government loses this revenue precisely when deficits are expanding. The mechanics of the bloated balance sheet thus create fiscal pressures that complicate monetary policy independence. The political economy dimension cannot be ignored. The US government has grown accustomed to low borrowing costs enabled partly by Fed purchases. Federal debt has exploded to over $35 trillion, requiring constant refinancing and new issuance. The Treasury Department needs robust demand for its debt to fund government operations without triggering a debt crisis. If the Fed withdraws as a major buyer while simultaneously raising rates, the government faces substantially higher interest expenses. This isn't theoretical. Net interest on the national debt has already surpassed $1 trillion annually, exceeding defense spending and becoming one of the largest budget items. Further increases strain fiscal sustainability and force difficult political choices about spending and taxation. The Fed's balance sheet thus intersects directly with America's fiscal trajectory in ways that limit policy flexibility. Consider the international implications. The dollar's role as the global reserve currency depends partly on deep, liquid treasury markets. Foreign governments, corporations, and investors hold dollars and dollar-denominated assets because they trust the stability and accessibility of these markets. When the Fed's actions create volatility in treasury markets, it raises questions about dollar hegemony. China, Russia, and other nations have already been diversifying away from dollar reserves. European and Asian central banks watch Fed policy carefully because changes in dollar liquidity affect their own monetary conditions through exchange rates and capital flows. The $9.1 trillion position isn't just an American problem, it's embedded in the architecture of global finance. The banking system presents yet another constraint. Banks hold significant quantities of treasuries and mortgage securities on their balance sheets. When interest rates rise and bond prices fall, these holdings lose value. This is what triggered the crisis at Silicon Valley Bank and other regional banks in 2023. Banks that loaded up on long-term bonds during the low-rate era suddenly faced massive unrealized losses as the Fed tightened policy. If the Fed accelerates quantitative tightening, it exacerbates this pressure. More banks potentially face solvency questions. The Fed, in its role as banking regulator and lender of last resort, must balance its monetary policy objectives against financial stability concerns. A rapid reduction of its balance sheet could precipitate banking stress that forces intervention, undermining the very tightening the Fed seeks to achieve. There's also the question of market functioning. The Treasury market experienced severe disruptions in March 2020 when pandemic panic caused liquidity to evaporate, yields gyrated wildly, and the Fed had to intervene as a buyer of last resort to restore order. This revealed fragility in what should be the world's deepest, most liquid market. Since then, structural issues persist. Dealer capacity has shrunk relative to market size. Regulatory requirements limit banks' ability to make markets during stress. High-frequency trading algorithms can amplify volatility. In this environment, the Fed's presence as a large, stable holder provides a backstop to market function. Removing this support too quickly risks triggering another dash-for-cash moment where market participants scramble for liquidity and normal trading breaks down. The inflation context adds complexity. The Fed raised rates aggressively in 2022 and 2023 to combat inflation that reached 40-year highs. This was the right policy response, but it created the interest rate shock that generated banking stress and bond market losses. Now, as inflation moderates, there are calls for rate cuts to support economic growth and employment. But the balance sheet remains enormous, creating a disconnect. The Fed cannot simply cut rates back to near zero while maintaining such a large portfolio of assets. That would recreate the conditions that contributed to inflation in the first place. Yet it also cannot aggressively shrink the balance sheet while raising or maintaining high rates without risking financial instability. These constraints leave the Fed threading an impossibly narrow needle. Demographics and structural trends tighten the trap further. An aging population means more retirees depending on fixed-income investments for retirement security. When bond prices fall due to Fed selling, it directly impacts the wealth and income of millions of seniors. This creates political pressure on the central bank to moderate its actions. Meanwhile, government entitlement spending continues rising as baby boomers age, increasing deficits and the need for treasury financing. The Fed cannot ignore these long-term fiscal dynamics when making monetary policy decisions. The $9.1 trillion position exists within this broader context of demographic shift and fiscal stress that limits policy options. Corporate debt markets add another layer. American corporations borrowed heavily during the years of low rates and Fed asset purchases. Investment-grade and junk bond issuance reached record levels as companies took advantage of cheap financing. Much of this debt will need refinancing in coming years at substantially higher rates. If the Fed's balance sheet reduction pushes rates even higher, it could trigger defaults and credit stress in the corporate sector. This would flow through to employment, investment, and economic growth. The Fed must consider these transmission channels when calibrating its policy. The interconnectedness of modern financial markets means that actions targeting government debt ripple unpredictably through credit markets. The commercial real estate sector presents perhaps the most acute near-term risk. Office buildings, retail properties, and other commercial real estate face challenges from remote work, e-commerce, and changing business models. Property values have declined in many markets, and loans tied to these properties are coming due for refinancing. Regional and community banks have heavy exposure to commercial real estate. If the Fed's tightening exacerbates stress in this sector, it could trigger bank failures and credit contraction. The central bank must weigh its balance sheet decisions against the stability of this crucial part of the financial system. Once again, the $9 trillion portfolio constrains flexibility because rapid unwinding threatens fragile sectors. There's also the question of what normal actually means. Some argue the Fed should return to its pre-crisis balance sheet size relative to GDP. Others suggest the financial system has structurally changed and requires a permanently larger Fed presence. The growth of money market funds, the retreat of traditional banks from market making, and increased volatility all point toward potential structural needs for more Fed involvement. If this is true, then the $9 trillion isn't an aberration to be corrected, but rather a reflection of how modern finance operates. This philosophical debate has profound policy implications. If the old normal no longer exists, the Fed might be trapped at elevated balance sheet levels indefinitely. International coordination, or the lack of it, complicates matters. The European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, and Bank of England all expanded their balance sheets dramatically in recent decades. If all major central banks attempt to reduce holdings simultaneously, the collective impact on global bond markets could be overwhelming. Yet coordinating balance sheet policies across independent central banks is practically impossible. Each faces domestic pressures and different economic conditions. The Fed must consider how its actions interact with global monetary policy, but it cannot control what other central banks do. This creates uncertainty and potential for market disruptions that further constrain Fed flexibility. The political independence of the Federal Reserve itself becomes relevant. The central bank's legitimacy depends on being seen as technocratic and apolitical, making decisions based on economic analysis rather than political pressure. But the scale of the balance sheet and its implications for government financing, housing markets, and wealth distribution inevitably draw political attention. Presidential candidates, congressional leaders, and interest groups all have opinions about what the Fed should do. Maintaining independence while managing a $9 trillion portfolio that affects so many constituencies requires careful navigation. Any hint that political considerations influence policy decisions undermines the institutional credibility the Fed needs to function effectively. Looking at the historical precedent, or rather the lack of one, clarifies the challenge. No central bank has ever attempted to unwind asset purchases on this scale. The Fed's first effort at quantitative tightening from 2017 to 2019 involved reducing the balance sheet from $4.5 trillion to $3.7 trillion. Even this modest reduction contributed to financial market stress in late 2018 that caused the Fed to pause and eventually reverse course. That experience suggests unwinding the full $9 trillion would require decades and could face repeated interruptions when financial or economic conditions deteriorate. The practical reality is that much of this portfolio may become permanent, representing a fundamental shift in how central banking operates in America. The technological and market structure changes add uncertainty. The rise of cryptocurrencies, digital assets, and potential central bank digital currencies could alter how monetary policy transmits through the economy. High-frequency trading and algorithmic market making have changed bond market dynamics. The growth of passive investing and index funds affects how markets respond to Fed actions. These structural changes mean that unwinding the balance sheet could have effects different from what historical models predict. The Fed operates partly in the dark, uncertain how financial markets will respond to unprecedented balance sheet reduction in a transformed financial landscape. Climate transition and energy policy intersect with Fed decisions in subtle ways. The shift toward renewable energy requires massive infrastructure investment funded through bond markets. If Fed tightening raises borrowing costs too much, it could slow the energy transition with long-term economic and geopolitical consequences. Some argue the Fed should explicitly consider climate risks in its policy framework, while others insist it should focus narrowly on inflation and employment. Regardless of one's view, the reality is that the central bank's decisions about its $9 trillion portfolio affect capital allocation across the economy, including for climate-related investments. This adds another dimension to the policy constraints the Fed faces. The path forward, if one exists, likely involves accepting that the balance sheet will remain elevated for far longer than initially envisioned. The Fed might gradually reduce holdings during periods of economic strength, while being prepared to expand again during downturns. This would represent a fundamental shift toward the Fed as a permanent, active participant in bond markets, rather than an emergency responder that withdraws once crises pass. Such an approach has profound implications for market functioning, fiscal policy, and the Fed's role in the economy. It represents uncharted territory with uncertain long-term consequences for American capitalism. Ultimately, the $9.1 trillion crisis reflects deeper truths about modern economies and the limits of monetary policy. Central banks were forced into extraordinary measures because fiscal authorities proved unable or unwilling to respond adequately to economic shocks. The Fed's balance sheet expanded to fill gaps left by political dysfunction and inadequate government action. Now that expansion constrains the central bank's ability to operate independently. The Fed cannot simply reverse course because doing so would expose the underlying fragility and unsustainability of current fiscal and financial arrangements. The balance sheet serves as a band-aid covering structural problems in government finances, housing policy, and financial regulation. Removing it would reveal wounds that the political system seems unprepared to treat. This isn't a temporary predicament that will resolve itself through technical policy adjustments. It's a fundamental challenge that questions whether the Federal Reserve can fulfill its traditional mandate in an era of chronic fiscal deficits, political polarization, and global financial instability. The $9 trillion portfolio represents the price of stabilizing the economy through monetary policy alone, when broader reforms proved impossible. That price now comes due in the form of constrained policy flexibility, potential market disruptions, and difficult trade-offs between inflation control, financial stability, and fiscal sustainability. The Fed's predicament mirrors America's broader economic challenges, problems deferred through monetary expansion that eventually must be confronted, with no easy solutions in sight.